Turn back to 1 Kings chapter 12 this morning, quickly, as we continue looking at the life of this man, Rehoboam. And we noted last time that God gave Rehoboam a glorious opportunity to unite the kingdom under him and under God. But he rejected that choice because Rehoboam refused to be a servant. He wanted to dictate. He wanted to lord over the people. And he had no excuse, because if you look at his background, he had so many advantages. He had a godly grandfather, King David, who set the great example for him as what a king should be. He had a father, Solomon, who through his own failures and his own writings warned Rehoboam many times how he should conduct himself as king. He was surrounded by wise men, godly men. We saw them last week, that he was able to draw counsel from. And of course, he had famous prophets like Nathan and Abijah, who were prophets in his kingdom. And on top of all of that, he had God that he could have turned to for wisdom and for help. But Rehoboam's problem, like a lot of people, wasn't that he didn't know what to do. He knew what to do. He just didn't want to do it. And because of that, Rehoboam destroyed not just his kingdom, but his own life as well. And there are a number of consequences to his failure. And the first one we'll see straight away in verse 16, humiliation and loss. It says, "So when all Israel saw that the king hearkened not unto them," that's Rehoboam, "the people answered the king, saying, What portion have we in David? Neither have we inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel. Now see to thine own house, Israel." So Israel departed unto their tents. So Rehoboam's foolishness lost him around 70 to 80% of his people and his kingdom. And no doubt his exchequer was hit as well. His economy was hit as well. He lost financially, he lost numerically, he lost the glory of his kingdom, and he lost spiritually by the choices that he made. And he was humiliated on the day of his so-called coronation. The majority of the people turned their backs on him. And not only did they turn their backs on him, they humiliated him with the language. They said, "What portion have we in David? Neither have we inheritance in the son of Jesse." This is an old insult that King Saul hurled decades before at King David when he called him the son of Jesse. You're Jesse's a nobody from Bethlehem, and you're nothing but the son of Jesse. Downplaying his royal connections and the royal family, and just emphasizing his lowly roots. 50 years after or before this incident, Sheba in 2 Samuel chapter 20 does the same thing. He hurls the same insult. "What portion have we in the son of Jesse, the house of David?" And he encouraged a rebellion 50 years before this incident, when the northern tribes also rebelled against King David. So here's an old insult. An insult that's to hurt the family of this man Rehoboam, to de-emphasize his royal roots and his right to reign, and says, what right has he? Now you'll notice in the language in verse 16, not only is it insulting, humiliating, but you'll notice the people, the majority of the people don't mention one person, God. God's not in their thinking. God's not in their decisions. They're not seeking the will of God. And just like Rehoboam refused to seek God's will, refused to seek God's help at the start of his reign, likewise the people, or at least the majority of the people, ignored God as well. And you'll always find this. Like leader, like people. Like father, like children. Church leaders, like church members. Like state rulers, like citizens. It always follows. People generally follow the example set before them. And Rehoboam was a man, like his father Solomon, who generally refused to seek God's will, refused to obey God's will. And because of that, the people just lived the same way. And they tell him straight, we don't want you as our king. You are nothing to us. And they turned their backs on Rehoboam. And you'll see from the map on the screen what a terrible loss it was to Rehoboam's prestige and his power. He lost 70 to 80% of his territory. And the northern kingdom, led by Jeroboam, now emerges. And Rehoboam is just left with this little patch of land of two tribes, Judah and Benjamin, with the royal city of Jerusalem. And no doubt the economists of his day were telling him, wow, what a depression we're now in. Our economy has collapsed. 80% of our revenue disappeared. 80% of our taxpayers disappeared. And the glorious kingdom that you can see there, that was built up by his grandfather, King David, and became the richest place on earth under his father Solomon, has now been torn apart. And through the foolishness of one man, the folly of one man, everything has been lost. King David was king for 40 years. Solomon for 40 years. So 80 years of hard work, 80 years of investments, 80 years of building this kingdom, this empire, was all undone with a few words of foolish people. And what does it remind us as we read these verses? First of all, it tells us people are fickle, aren't they? The people that praised you yesterday can turn on you tomorrow. And if you build your identity on the popularity of people, the praise of people, you'll be very sadly let down by that. Remember the same mob who cried Hosanna when the Lord Jesus Christ came into Jerusalem, just a few days later cried what? Crucify him. Crucify him. And the people that were loyal and served the house of David, the kingdom of David, weren't long in turning their backs on it, the majority of them, and running away. And of course, a second reminder as you read this story is this, is that don't get too attached to achievements, monuments, legacies, buildings, because these things can quickly be lost. Everything that David and Solomon built, or not everything, but the majority of it, was lost in just a moment of time. And as a reminder to you and I, don't get too attached to the things of this world. Don't get too consumed with stocks and shares and properties and savings and CPF, because what can go up today can go down tomorrow. What can be gained today can be lost tomorrow. And Rehoboam lost the majority of these things. In fact, the remnants of the great empires, where are they today? They're either in museums or they're just dusty monuments ignored by most people who pass by. Now, the second consequence of Rehoboam's folly and foolishness comes just immediately after that. Because verse 18, it says, then King Rehoboam. You see, here's the problem with a fool like Rehoboam. A fool will always continue to do foolish things, continue to say foolish things. One bad choice will lead to another bad choice. Leopards don't change their spots. That's why you're a fool if you hang around with a fool. If you do business with a fool, you marry a fool, because that's who they are. And Rehoboam follows one foolish decision with another foolish decision. Because it says in verse 18, he sent Adoram, or Adoram. Now, who is Adoram? Adoram was the chief tax collector for King Solomon. The guy that oppressed the children of Israel. The guy that symbolized the persecution and the oppression that Solomon brought the nation under when he enslaved them and made them taxpayers and took their money and took their people from them to enrich himself. And Adoram was the head of that. He was kind of the head of the Iris who had overtaxed the people. A hated figure. And Rehoboam shows his stupidity and his naivety in pouring oil upon the fire here, in sending a person who's particularly hated. Shows how foolish he is. And he sends him down to arrogantly demand tax from these 10 northern tribes who just turned their backs on him. And what happens? This hated figure, Adoram, they stone him, kill him. And this kingdom of the 10 northern tribes is now torn apart from the other tribes. And it begins with bloodshed, begins with murder. And it will continue like this for the next 220 years of its existence. Divided, bitter, and full of bloodshed. One murder will lead to another murder. One dynasty will lead to another dynasty. Rebellion will be key to the description of the kingdom of Israel, this 10 northern tribe kingdom. And Rehoboam, what a fool. And what happens to him? The end of verse 18. Therefore King Rehoboam made speed to get him up in a chariot to flee to Jerusalem. He had to run away, run for his life, lest he would be the next one that they murdered on this day. And what began as a trip from Jerusalem up to Shechem for his coronation, what was meant to be the greatest day of Rehoboam's life, when he took the throne, when he took the power and the prestige of the empire, ended with utter humiliation and loss. Ended with Rehoboam running for his life back down to Jerusalem. And from this moment onwards, the kingdom of Israel, as is now called, the northern kingdom, led by Jeroboam, and the kingdom of Judah, led by Rehoboam, will be permanently divided. And for the next 220 years, these nations will coexist next door to each other, a bit like Malaysia and Singapore, but will be independent sovereign nations. And the split will be permanent, thanks to the folly of Rehoboam. And the sad thing is, these people had so much in common. And often people who have so much in common fall out the most and fall out the worst in their divisions one for another. Many years ago, in the Bolshevik Revolution at the turn of the 20th century in Russia, when the Bolsheviks swept into the city of Moscow to take it over, where were the churches? The churches were meeting in a grand building in Moscow. And what were they doing? They were fighting over a dispute. And what was the dispute about? What length should the candles be in the church? That was what the argument was. And what they were dividing over. And often people who should know better end up in bitter disputes. And typical of foolish people, Rehoboam adds more foolishness to his decisions. Because in verse 21 we're told, and when Rehoboam was come to Jerusalem, what does he decide to do? He gathers the house of Judah, the tribe of Benjamin, the two tribes he's left, 180,000 chosen men, 180,000 men, which were warriors. What's he going to do? To fight against the house of Israel, to bring the kingdom again to Rehoboam, the son of Solomon. Now, why do I say this is folly? Well, number one, God has already stated, prophesied through Ahijah the prophet, that this kingdom was to be rent in two. This is God's will. This is God's plan. And Jeroboam was to be the next king over the 10 tribes in the north. God had already stated this as a fact. And this is God's prophetic future for the nation. And yet Rehoboam still refuses to accept God's will. And he says, rather than accept God's will, rather than submit, rather than repent of my own arrogance, my own foolishness, what does he do? I'm going to compound my folly. by going and causing a civil war. Now, why was it such foolishness? Number one, because it was against God's will. And number two, because Rehoboam likely would have got hammered, slaughtered. Jeroboam, who was leading the 10 northern tribes, he had the majority of the people on his side. And Jeroboam was a very experienced, charismatic individual, very talented man. In fact, that's why King Solomon, who could read people like a book, appointed Jeroboam to a very prestigious position because of his capabilities, his talents. And Jeroboam would have been a very formidable foe. He would have been a far more formidable leader of men in battle than an individual like Rehoboam. Rehoboam was just a playboy prince who had never done a day's work in his life. Soft hands, soft heart. That was Rehoboam. A man who couldn't stand up, no doubt, in the heat of the battle. And here's Rehoboam, this soft playboy prince. He says, well, I'm going to start a war now. And I'm going to take my little army, and I'm going to up and face this great leader Jeroboam and his great army, and I'm going to crush them. No chance. Utter foolishness by Rehoboam to even think. And here's a man, Rehoboam, and you'll see this throughout his life, who just keeps on making mistake after mistake after mistake. Bad choice after bad choice. You've heard me say this before. Everybody makes mistakes, but only a fool refuses to learn from his mistakes. King David made mistakes, but he learned from them. He made some terrible mistakes, but he never repeated them again. When David committed adultery and murder and was forced by God to repent of it and dealt with by God, he never repeated it again. Never got involved with other women like that again. And he learned from the terrible mistakes he made. But Rehoboam doesn't. He just keeps on going. And if God doesn't intervene here, this kingdom of King David, this empire, is not just going to be torn apart. It's going to be obliterated. Because the southern kingdom, the two tribes of Benjamin and Judah, they had some powerful fighters also. They were not insignificant. We know from the Bible that Benjamin was the warrior tribe. It was the tribe that King Saul was chosen from. They were left-handed men, the Benjamites. They could throw stones. And the tribe of Judah was the tribe of King David. They were great fighters. And they had mighty men from those tribes. Men who faced giants. So if this battle went ahead between the 10 northern tribes, led by the experienced, charismatic, talented Jeroboam, the large army, against the smaller army, but a very powerful smaller army, led by this playboy prince, Rehoboam, you could be sure that the consequence of such a battle would be that the total armies of the two areas would have been decimated. It would have ended up like the Second World War at the Battle of the Somme. They would have just kept fighting for years and years and years. And going forward 6 feet and then back 6 feet. And thousands, no doubt millions, would have lost their lives in such a civil war. And if God doesn't intervene, it's over for the nation of Israel. And God now intervenes because we're told he sends word from him through a man called Shemaiah, the man of God, verse 22. And what a title that is to have after your name. Shemaiah, the man of God. And Shemaiah comes down in verse 23. Speak unto Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, king of Judah, and unto all the house of Judah and Benjamin, and to the remnant of the people, saying, Thus saith the Lord, Ye shall not go up, nor fight against your brethren, the children of Israel. Return every man to his house, for this thing is from me. God says, this is my will. This is my choice. I want this kingdom divided. This group needs to be removed, these 10 northern tribes, in order for the two tribes to continue on for further generations. And God says, this is my purpose, This is my plan. Don't resist it. It will be disastrous if you do. And the remarkable thing, it says at the end of verse 24, they hearkened therefore to the word of the Lord and returned to depart according to the word of the Lord. It wasn't a lack of courage that made them do this. They weren't afraid to go to war, these southern tribes. It was because they heard God's voice. And even in this dark story, where nobody's listening to God, there's a remnant that are. And it's no surprise that the southern kingdom becomes the kingdom where there eventually emerges some righteous kings and righteous people. And the northern kingdom ends up in total apostasy and total destruction throughout the 220 years of his existence. And God has to intervene because Rehoboam can't be trusted to intervene. A foolish man like him leaves the nation in this disastrous situation. Now, let me say this. Sometimes, as much as we love people coming together and the unity amongst the people of God, sometimes it's better for them to go their separate ways. And here's a classic illustration of it. Sometimes for the good of the work of God, some people have to leave. Some people have to be separated. And later on we'll discover why. Because they can become a cancer. They can bring sin and their rebellious nature into the rest of the people of God. And here God says to Rehoboam and the leaders of the southern kingdom, let them go. Don't fight with them. It'll be for the best if they go. Because these 10 rebellious tribes led by this wicked man Jeroboam, who has no time for me, these 10 tribes, if they stay with you, they will be problems for you and to you. And God just says, let them go. Don't fight with them. There's an old saying that we used to hear growing up in Ireland, and they say this, don't fight with a skunk because you'll both end up smelly. And it's true. There's certain people you just have to say, go. Keep your distance. Go your way. And let them go. And you'll discover as they go, they'll never prosper. These 10 northern tribes who rebelled and went their way, just let them go. And over time, you'll discover that they never go anywhere. Spiritually, they go down, down, down. And in the end, they're left in total destruction. Total obliviation as a kingdom. And even to this day, nobody talks about the 10 northern tribes. Their kingdom never achieved anything, never reached anything of significance. And 220 years later, they were torn apart by the Assyrians and taken permanently into captivity and into oblivion. And the names of their kings, like Jeroboam and Ahab, are just names that people use to revile and are used in a negative sense. So sometimes, it's better to let certain people go and not get involved with them, not squabble with them. And Rehoboam has to learn this lesson. And thankfully he does. And the amazing thing is that Rehoboam and the leaders of the southern tribes obey the word of God. This is the first time really we can say that there's any sign of a spiritual change in Rehoboam. And to his credit, he listens to this man Shemaiah. Now Shemaiah is not famous for anything else in the Bible but this incident. And yet this one man, a man of God, was able to change the direction of his nation. Now what lessons should you and I learn this morning from this incident and the life of Rehoboam? I think the first lesson to learn is the connection between Solomon and Rehoboam. Sometimes people say Rehoboam is not like his father. And in some instances, that's so true. But in many instances, Rehoboam is very much his father's son. Because Solomon turned his back on God. Solomon refused to obey God's will. And Solomon made foolish decisions and brought in all kinds of foolishness into his kingdom. And Solomon taught by his example that God's will and God's way is negotiable. And Rehoboam and the people quickly learned to follow in the footsteps of this man Solomon. And every parent, every leader should take note of this truth, that the example you set in word and in deed will likely be the example that others will follow. And you make sure you learn that, not just in your home, but in the workplace and in the church. And younger, more or less mature people will look to you and follow in your footsteps. But then we have to learn this, that the reason that both Solomon and later Rehoboam fell into this foolishness was because they ignored God. When the Queen of Sheba came to visit Solomon, when Solomon was walking with God, she said this, how happy and how blessed are your people, and those who sit around your throne and listen to your wisdom. What a blessing it is to be in such a kingdom with such a man of wealth and power and wisdom like this man Solomon. And the Queen of Sheba, she looked enviously at even the servants of Solomon. And she more or less said, I would love to be one of his servants. But by the end of his life, nobody talked like that about Solomon. No one wanted to be in Solomon's kingdom anymore, because Solomon had drifted from God. And the closer you are to God, the more blessing you will be to those around you. But the converse is true. The further away from God you are, the less of a blessing. In fact, you become then a hindrance and a curse to those around you. But then a third thing we must notice is this, in passing, about this story, is that the effect of having the wrong friends and companions. You can't help but notice that one of the reasons Rehoboam got himself in such trouble was because he was close to the wrong people. His companions were fools and playboys like him. The Bible makes this statement in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Be not deceived. Don't fool yourself. Evil communications corrupt good manners. 1 Corinthians 15. Now, that's a verse that seems strange in English. And really, let me give you a simple way of translating it this way. Paul says this, be not deceived. In other words, don't kid yourself. Don't fool yourself. Wake up and smell the coffee. Don't think that you can be different from this rule. Evil communications. In other words, if you hang around with people who talk evil things, if you listen to those from your television or your computer who promote evil things, evil communications, he says, corrupts like a cancer your manners, your behavior. It'll get into you. And if you hang around with the wrong people, eventually their language, their vocabulary, their ideas, their values will get into your soul, get into your thinking, get into your decisions. And let me ask you a question. Who are you friends with today? Who's your closest buddies? Who do you like to hang around with? Who do you like to read the most? Who do you like to listen to the most? And you just audit your own life and you'll discover those are the people and the values that you will eventually share and be influenced by. And you'll notice as you go through the Bible, those who walked with God often had godly friends to walk beside them. We've been looking at the life of Moses. And who did Moses keep alongside him? Joshua, Aaron, Caleb, and men like that. And even Miriam, who walked with God for much of her life, she was close to Moses. And Moses was very careful with those around him. And he kept friends with those who were close to God and were in touch with God. King David, who was his best friend? A very godly man called Jonathan, a man who knew God, a man who had a heart for God, a man who was selfless, who was willing to give up his kingdom so that God's will would be done in the life of King David. Who was Daniel's friends down in Babylon? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. 3 young men who had said, we'd rather burn in the flames than bow down to the idols of Nebuchadnezzar. And who your friends are, who are your companions, will have a huge impact on your life. And of course, the one who'll be closest to you of all will be your spouse. Choose your spouse wisely. But then lastly, notice this, Rehoboam destroyed his life because he refused to let God lead his life. That's the ultimate weakness and failure in Rehoboam. We can talk about the influence of his father, the influence of his companions, and they all had a part to play. But at the end of the day, Rehoboam made his own choice, didn't he? And the choice that he made was to reject God's wisdom, was to ignore God in his life. And the question really you have to ask today is this. It's not can you trust God with the details of your life. The question really is, will you trust God with the details of your life? And if your answer to that is, I'm not sure, then you're a Rehoboam. You're just a modern day Rehoboam. And the church today is full of Rehoboams. People who know what they should do, who know what God's will is, but decide, doesn't suit me. I'd rather keep listening to my friends. I would rather keep listening to my own feelings, my own desires, my own ambitions. And if you find yourself making choices that way in your life, you're a Rehoboam. Doesn't matter that you call yourself a church member. Doesn't matter that you call yourself a Christian. You're a Rehoboam, a fool who keeps ignoring God. Many years ago, in the land of Wales, we've been talking about Wales over the last number of weeks. There was a traveling evangelist called William Williams. You used to see him first name as his surname. I don't know why. His mother must have run out of names. And she called her son William Williams. William Williams was called by God to go around Wales preaching the gospel on a horse. For the next 43 years of his life, he went round the land of Wales on horseback. And everywhere he went, he traveled 100,000 miles. He would take the Bible out in the Welsh language, and he would preach in Welsh, and he would preach in English. And he would sing in Welsh, and he would also sing in English. And as he thought about his life over many years, 43 years, of preaching the gospel and seeing multitudes converted, William Williams sat down one day and he took a pen and he took a piece of paper and he wrote these words, "Guide me, O thou great Jehovah, pilgrim through this barren land. I am weak, but thou art mighty. Hold me with thy powerful hand. Bread of heaven, feed me till I want no more." Now, he wrote it in Welsh, and it was translated then into English, and it became one of the great hymns of the land of Wales, and today they still sing it, even though the land doesn't know God, and the vast, vast majority of the people know nothing about the Scriptures. Most people in the land of Wales know this great hymn, and they still sing it at their sporting events. Guide me, O thou great Jehovah. Cum ronda. Ronda is the music of the hymn. We're going to stand now and listen to it sung by the Welsh from the Baptist Tabernacle Choir of Cardiff. And as you listen, they'll sing it first in English and then they'll finish off in Welsh. Think about those words. And if you have been living like a Rehoboam, living life by your own wisdom, making your own choices, then you sing these words prayerfully and you say to the Lord, Lord, guide me. From now on, guide me, O thou great Jehovah. But if you're not willing for God to guide you, don't sing. Don't sing. Don't say I'm a Christian and then refuse to live the life of a Christian. Don't say the Lord is my shepherd and then live as the Lord isn't your shepherd. If you say he's your shepherd, the psalmist says what? He leadeth me. So as you listen to these words and sing them carefully and wisely. Let's stand and listen. And after we have sung this hymn, we will move to the table of the Lord and meet around the Lord's table.